If you're eating clean, exercising regularly, and still can't get rid of stubborn belly fat, especially that deep abdominal fat, this video is for you, because the problem might not be calories, it might be cortisol. Visceral fat isn't just the fat you can pinch, it's the dangerous fat wrapped around your organs, and research shows it responds very differently to stress hormones than normal body fat. So today, I'll break down why high cortisol makes visceral fat so stubborn, what the science says about losing it without stressing your body, and how to structure your food and habits so fat loss works with your biology, not against it. Let's break it down step by step. What is visceral fat and why it's different? Visceral fat is metabolically active fat stored around organs like the liver and pancreas. Unlike subcutaneous fat, visceral fat has more cortisol receptors, releases inflammatory compounds, is strongly linked to insulin resistance, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. And here's the key point. High cortisol doesn't just store fat. It specifically tells your body to store it in the abdomen. This is why crash dieting, excessive cardio, poor sleep often lead to a flatter scale but a bigger waistline. Why zero cortisol really means no cortisol spikes. Cortisol itself is not bad. You need cortisol to wake up, regulate blood sugar, mobilize fat for fuel. The issue is chronically elevated cortisol caused by severe calorie restriction, overtraining, skipping meals, high sugar, plus low protein diets, poor sleep. When cortisol stays high, your body prioritizes fat storage, muscle breakdown increases, visceral fat becomes protected, so the goal is fat loss without triggering stress signals. The science-backed strategy to lose visceral fat. Let's walk through what actually works. 1. Eat enough protein to signal safety. Protein does more than build muscle. Studies show adequate protein reduces cortisol response to stress, improves insulin sensitivity, preserves lean mass during fat loss. Aim for 25-35 g protein per meal. Best low-stress protein sources: eggs, Greek yogurt, fish, lentils, whey protein, especially post-workout. This tells your body, we're not starving, you can let fat go. 2. Use smart carbs to lower cortisol. Very low-carb diets can spike cortisol, especially in stressed individuals. Instead, use slow-digesting carbs to blunt stress hormones. Best options: oats, sweet potatoes, rice, especially after workouts. Fruits like berries or papaya. Carbs lower cortisol, support thyroid function, improve sleep quality. Timing matters most. Eat carbs post-workout or at dinner to calm the nervous system. 3. Choose fats that target visceral fat. Not all fats are equal. Research shows that monounsaturated fats help reduce visceral fat specifically. Best sources: olive oil, avocados, nuts, seeds. Avoid excessive refined seed oils and trans fats, which increase inflammation and cortisol signaling. 4. Train to reduce stress, not add more. More exercise is not always better. High volume cardio plus calorie restriction, cortisol overload. Instead, 3 to 4 days of resistance training, short, controlled sessions, optional walking or light cycling. Strength training lowers baseline cortisol over time, improves insulin sensitivity, targets visceral fat more effectively than cardio alone. Most people believe belly fat is a food problem, but deep inside the body, a very different story is unfolding. One driven not by calories, but by stress chemistry. Hidden beneath the surface, wrapped tightly around your liver, pancreas, and intestines, visceral fat behaves less like stored energy and more like an active endocrine organ, constantly listening for one signal above all others: cortisol. Cortisol is not the villain it's often made out to be. It's the hormone that kept humans alive during famine, danger, and uncertainty. It raises blood sugar so you can move fast, mobilizes energy so you can survive, and sharpens focus in moments of threat. But when cortisol stops being temporary and starts becoming constant, the body changes its priorities in ways most people never realize. Research shows visceral fat tissue contains significantly more glucocorticoid receptors than subcutaneous fat, meaning it is biologically designed to respond more aggressively to cortisol. In simple terms, when stress hormones rise, visceral fat doesn't resist, it grows. This is why two people can eat the same calories, train the same way, and still look completely different around the waist. Studies published in journals like Obesity and Psychoneuroendocrinology show that individuals with chronically elevated cortisol tend to store fat centrally, even without overeating. The body interprets stress as danger, and danger signals one thing to your metabolism: store energy close to vital organs. Over time, this survival mechanism becomes pathological. Visceral fat begins releasing inflammatory cytokines like IL-6 and TNF-alpha, compounds that worsen insulin resistance and keep cortisol elevated even further. A feedback loop forms where stress creates fat and fat creates more stress, silently accelerating metabolic disease. What makes this especially dangerous is that visceral fat is largely invisible. You can be thin and still carry high levels of it. Medical imaging studies have shown that people with normal BMIs can have visceral fat levels comparable to those classified as obese, and their health risks are often just as severe. Elevated visceral fat has been directly linked to heart disease, stroke, fatty liver, and early mortality. One long-term study found that high waist circumference predicted cardiovascular death more accurately than body weight alone, and cortisol is often the upstream driver. Modern lifestyles keep cortisol elevated in ways our biology was never designed to handle. Skipped meals, sleep deprivation, constant notifications, high-intensity workouts without recovery, ultra-low-calorie diets, and chronic psychological stress all activate the same stress pathways. Blood sugar drops trigger cortisol release, extreme dieting increases cortisol output, overtraining does the same, even inflammation from poor food quality amplifies cortisol signaling, and when cortisol rises repeatedly, the enzyme 11B-HSD1 inside visceral fat tissue converts inactive cortisone into active cortisol locally, essentially creating a stress factory inside your abdomen. This means visceral fat doesn't just respond to cortisol, it manufactures it. This is why crash dieting often backfires so dramatically. Research consistently shows that aggressive calorie restriction raises cortisol while lowering thyroid hormones, slowing metabolism, and protecting visceral fat. People lose weight, but disproportionately from muscle and peripheral fat, while abdominal fat remains stubborn or even increases. MRI studies confirm that rapid weight loss without adequate protein and recovery leads to preferential fat regain in the visceral region. The body remembers stress. It prepares for the next threat by reinforcing the very fat depot that keeps vital organs fueled under pressure. Sleep deprivation alone can elevate cortisol by up to 37% the following day. In controlled studies, participants restricted to 5 hours of sleep stored significantly more fat in the abdominal region, even when calorie intake remained the same. One experiment showed that poor sleep shifted fat storage toward visceral depots while simultaneously increasing hunger hormones. The body was being programmed to store, not burn. Cortisol was the conductor orchestrating the shift. Even exercise, widely praised as the solution to belly fat, can become a double-edged sword. While moderate resistance training lowers baseline cortisol over time, excessive endurance training without sufficient fuel elevates it chronically. Marathon runners with low energy availability often show elevated cortisol and increased visceral fat relative to expectations. The body doesn't care that exercise is intentional, it only responds to physiological stress. What makes cortisol so powerful is that it doesn't just influence fat storage, it rewires behavior. Elevated cortisol increases cravings for quick energy, especially sugar and refined carbohydrates. It reduces impulse control and increases emotional eating. Neuroimaging studies show cortisol dampens activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term decision-making. This means stress doesn't just make fat easier to store, it makes discipline harder to maintain. The struggle becomes personal, but the cause is biological. The most shocking part is that many people trying hardest to lose belly fat are unknowingly pushing cortisol higher every day. Skipping breakfast to burn fat, drinking excessive caffeine, stacking cardio sessions, sleeping less to fit workouts in, all send the same message to the nervous system: resources are scarce. And the body responds exactly as it was designed to, by defending visceral fat at all costs. This is why visceral fat loss is less about forcing the body and more about convincing it. Studies show that stabilizing blood sugar, improving sleep quality, increasing protein intake, and reducing psychological stress can lower cortisol levels even without drastic calorie changes. When cortisol drops, insulin sensitivity improves, inflammation decreases, and visceral fat becomes metabolically accessible again. The body no longer feels under attack. In clinical settings, interventions that reduce stress hormones consistently reduce waist circumference faster than scale weight. Mind-body stress reduction, resistance training, adequate carbohydrate intake, and sufficient recovery all show measurable reductions in visceral fat independent of weight loss. This confirms a crucial truth: belly fat is not just stored energy, it's stored alarm. Visceral fat is your body's emergency reserve, built to protect you when the world feels unsafe. But in a modern environment where stress never turns off, that protection becomes a liability. Cortisol keeps the vault sealed shut. Until the stress signal quiets, the fat stays locked in place. And this is why the solution isn't punishment, restriction, or endless effort. It's restoring signals of safety at the biological level. When cortisol normalizes, visceral fat no longer needs to exist. The body lets go, not because it's forced to, but because it finally believes it can. That is the hidden reason visceral fat is so stubborn, and the real reason it disappears only when stress does. For decades, fat loss has been framed as a battle of willpower, a test of discipline, a simple math equation of calories in versus calories out. But the human body does not experience weight loss as math. It experiences it as stress, and when the body perceives stress, it does not cooperate, it defends. Sustainable fat loss doesn't begin with burning more energy. It begins with lowering the internal signals that tell the body it is under threat. This is the missing link most people never hear about, and it explains why so many efforts fail despite relentless effort. Physiological stress is not just emotional pressure or anxiety. It is any signal that tells your nervous system that survival may be at risk. Severe calorie restriction, blood sugar crashes, sleep deprivation, inflammation, overtraining, nutrient deficiencies, and chronic mental strain all activate the same biological alarm system. That system is governed by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and when it stays switched on for too long, the body enters a defensive state where fat loss becomes biologically unsafe. In this state, hormones shift away from repair and fat oxidation and toward preservation. Cortisol rises, thyroid output declines, insulin sensitivity worsens, muscle breakdown increases, fat oxidation slows, and the body becomes exceptionally efficient at storing energy, especially in visceral fat depots that protect vital organs. This is not a flaw. It is an ancient survival response. Studies show that under chronic stress, the body prioritizes survival over aesthetics every single time. One of the most overlooked drivers of physiological stress is underfueling. Even diets that appear healthy can signal danger if energy intake remains too low for too long. Research consistently shows that prolonged calorie deficits elevate cortisol while suppressing leptin, the hormone that signals energy sufficiency. Low leptin tells the brain that starvation is possible even if body fat remains high. This disconnect explains why people can feel exhausted, hungry, cold, and stuck despite carrying excess fat. The body is conserving, not burning. Protein plays a critical role here. Adequate protein intake reduces cortisol responses to stress and preserves lean tissue during fat loss. Clinical studies demonstrate that higher protein diets maintain resting metabolic rate and reduce fat regain after weight loss. Muscle is metabolically expensive tissue. When protein intake is insufficient, the body breaks muscle down to reduce energy demand. Fat loss slows as a result. Preserving muscle tells the body that strength and resilience are still required, lowering the perceived threat. Blood sugar stability is another powerful signal of safety. Sharp glucose drops activate cortisol and adrenaline to restore circulating energy. This is why skipping meals, extreme fasting, or consuming highly refined carbohydrates can backfire under stress. Research shows that stable blood glucose reduces stress hormone output and improves insulin sensitivity, allowing fat to be mobilized more easily. This does not mean constant eating. It means strategic fueling that prevents repeated metabolic emergencies. Sleep may be the most underestimated fat loss tool of all. Even short-term sleep restriction dramatically alters hormonal balance. Studies reveal that poor sleep increases cortisol, increases ghrelin, decreases leptin, and shifts fat storage toward the abdominal region. In controlled trials, participants sleeping fewer than 6 hours per night lost less fat and more muscle compared to those sleeping 7 to 9 hours, even with identical calorie intake. Sleep is not passive recovery. It is active metabolic regulation. Exercise, when applied correctly, lowers physiological stress over time. Resistance training improves insulin sensitivity, increases muscle mass, and reduces baseline cortisol levels. But when exercise volume exceeds recovery capacity, it becomes another stressor layered onto an already overloaded system. Research on athletes shows that low energy availability combined with high training volume elevates cortisol chronically and impairs fat metabolism. The body responds by holding on tighter, not letting go. Psychological stress is inseparable from physical stress. The brain does not distinguish between emotional threat and physiological threat. Financial pressure, relationship strain, chronic worry, and lack of control all activate the same hormonal pathways. Neuroendocrine studies demonstrate that perceived stress alone can elevate cortisol independent of physical activity or diet. This is why two people following the same program can experience wildly different results. Their internal environments are not the same. Perhaps the most shocking finding from modern research is that reducing stress often improves body composition even without aggressive weight loss efforts. Interventions focused on stress reduction, sleep improvement, resistance training, and adequate nutrition consistently reduce waist circumference and visceral fat independent of total body weight changes. In some studies, participants lost inches before losing pounds. This challenges the idea that fat loss must always be forced through restriction. The body releases fat when it feels safe enough to do so. Safety signals include sufficient energy availability, stable blood sugar, consistent sleep, manageable training loads, and psychological recovery. When these conditions are met, cortisol normalizes, thyroid function improves, inflammation decreases, and fat oxidation increases naturally. The process becomes cooperative rather than combative. This is why sustainable fat loss feels different from extreme dieting. It does not feel frantic. It does not feel desperate. It does not rely on constant restraint. Instead, it feels regulated. Hunger becomes predictable. Energy stabilizes. Cravings quiet down. Progress becomes steady rather than volatile. The body is no longer fighting for survival. It is adapting. Long-term studies on weight maintenance consistently show that individuals who keep fat off share common traits: adequate sleep, regular resistance training, sufficient protein intake, and lower perceived stress levels. These factors matter more than any specific diet style. The body remembers how it lost weight. If weight loss occurred under extreme stress, it prepares to regain. If it occurred under stable conditions, it allows maintenance. The uncomfortable truth is that pushing harder often produces the opposite of what people want. More restriction, more cardio, less sleep, and more pressure amplify the very signals that lock fat in place. Fat loss is not unlocked by intensity, it is unlocked by regulation. Physiological stress is the lens through which the body interprets every fat loss attempt. Ignore it and progress stalls, respect it, and the body responds. This is not about doing less. It is about doing what aligns with human biology rather than fighting it. Sustainable fat loss is not a punishment the body endures. It is a state the body permits. And when the internal environment shifts from threat to safety, fat loss stops being a struggle and starts becoming a consequence. That is why lowering physiological stress is not a side strategy. It is the strategy.